If you're watching this, there's a good chance that, according to YouTube's wonderful and famously very accurate metrics measuring system, that you're between the ages of 25 and 34. Like me. Weird opening, right? But what I'm trying to say is that you've probably lived through at least one moral panic that you can remember. In fact, some moral panics have been going on for so long that they've basically been going on our entire lives. Here's a fun game. Guess in the comments which moral panics you think have been going on for at least 35 years. Actually, it's more like 50. But still, and I'll tell you all when we get to it in the video and I mention it. As you can probably guess from, the way I look, the things I say, things like my name and this t-shirt, I'm no stranger to moral panics. And the funny thing about it is, how badly people misunderstand things that lots of people do. Like, I might look like a gig-going Attila the Hun, but I'm not out here trying to dismantle everything you hold dear. Well, I guess I kind of am, but I'm not doing it through some kind of shady plot. I conduct my business in public because I have nothing to hide. This video is a little different from my recent ones. I've had a blast doing some research into areas I don't usually look into properly, so if you want me to do more things like this, then make sure that you like and subscribe and do all of the good things with this video. And if you really want to tell me what kind of topics to cover, the best way is to subscribe to the Patreon. It will be down below, where you get to vote on the topics of the videos, and if you're at certain tiers, you can even directly suggest video topics to me. By the end of this video, we should have gone over what a moral panic looks like, had a look at some examples of moral panics and what we can learn from that. I also want to think a little bit about who benefits from moral panics. The answer probably won't surprise you, but let's go ahead and find out.
Anatomy of a moral panic.
So, when we're talking about moral panics, we need to understand what exactly it is that people tend to react strongly to. If we were to see someone behaving within the boundaries of what we consider typically acceptable, we probably wouldn't find much cause to react to it. That goes for both legally enforced boundaries, like how we're not supposed to headbutt random people in the street, which would probably get you arrested, and it applies to less formal social norms, like the general requirement that you wear a shirt in public in most situations. Yeah, you could go out in the cold winter without a shirt on, but you would probably attract some strange looks at the very least. It's also important at the very beginning of this to say that going against social norms isn't always bad. I just picked examples that were hopefully easy for us to understand there. I'll also note that there is a technical term for this in sociology which I won't be using for reasons which will be obvious a bit later on when we see which groups tend to be the victims of moral panics, but for completeness, I will say that the term is deviance, which refers to any behavior that violates social norms. I don't feel particularly comfortable using that term, so I'm going to talk around it. If you want to look up some of the theory behind this, that's the term you need to look it up. You can go do that in your own time. One of the main groups that turn people acting outside of social norms into a full-blown moral panic are the press. I feel like I talk about the press or people in the press every video. So literally just click on almost any other video I've done. It's in the playlist, the convenient The Important Videos playlist, to get my complete thoughts on them. But the main thing to understand about the press is that they have an incentive to incite moral panics. The main incentive is that if you stoke a lot of panic and hysteria about something that people don't know a lot about, it's a good way for you to get some eyes on your content. And since we live in the content economy, that's probably what you want to do. That's good if you're, say, an insane right-wing news channel in the US, and don't worry, I'll be sharing a specific example from the hated Fox News later on. Or if you're a British newspaper whose primary audience is incredibly puce, balding men in the home counties, or gin-addled middle-class women who want genital inspectors at every bathroom. It's not so good if you're in one of the groups who get targeted by this. There is another incentive at play here, which is that if you're invested in social norms and don't want things to change, for whatever reason, I do have some speculative thoughts on the reasoning, one part of it is, well, if one thing can change, can't other things change? And what if the status quo is working quite well for you? Might change be a bit scary? or even a bit threatening. And as we know, the British press are some of the most vicious actors in the defence of the status quo, or at least slowing change to a pace that means it can be done in a deliberate way that preserves the privileges that they enjoy. Let's go to a definition of moral panics just to see whether we've hit on all of the main points so far.
Moral panic is defined as a public mass movement based on false or exaggerated perceptions or information that exceeds the actual threat society is facing. Moral panic is a widespread fear and often an irrational threat to society's values, interests, and safety.
There's a couple of key words in there: false and exaggerated, and they're going to be a recurring theme, particularly the exaggeration. Now, exaggeration isn't exactly something that everyone is innocent of. Just look at some of the things I say in these videos, but there's a difference in purpose. When the press decides to exaggerate because they have a particular platform, that means that people or governments may act on their exaggerations. That is something we do tend to see with moral panics when they get traction. Often people who have been scared by the conjured up folk devil demand some kind of action. The sad thing is that most politicians tend to resemble this.
Mayor, this sewer debacle has gone on long enough. As your largest campaign contributor, I demand action.
Very well. $80 worth of action it is.
Which is fine for a plot point in a cartoon. It's a little less good in real life when real people are in the firing line. We'll see where this demand to act can lead in a little bit. But let's just say it can vary and it isn't necessarily harmless every time. If you want an example I've touched on in a previous video, the press in the UK's general anti-youth moral panics, which, let's be honest, were a framing that was used primarily for anti-black racism and anti-black positions, were eventually taken up by the new Labour government, who colluded in that moral panic and did things like those weird mosquito machines that were put outside shops to like damage the hearing of young people or whatever. We have enough information to start to build a step-by-step guide for what a moral panic typically looks like. Though I should say there can be variations on this, because let's be honest, sometimes the press really doesn't manage to make the moral panic stick, and sometimes the government just looks at something and shrugs. Or is totally unable to do anything about it, but you know, that's a whole other thing. So stage one of a moral panic is typically that something exists outside of the social norm and an inciting incident either occurs or is fabricated. So the first stage is probably the simplest. Something just exists. It's wild, I know, things be existing. Sometimes people like and enjoy things that aren't popular or accepted by the mainstream or the majority of people, or are members of groups that are generally unaccepted by the population at large. A good example of this is the Dungeons & Dragons moral panic. Maybe it's hard to imagine now with stuff like Critical Role and Stranger Things, but there was once a time where D&D was the preserve of a much narrower group of even nerdier people. Yeah, I know, who would have guessed that a role-playing game that was incredibly inaccessible in early editions in an age before the internet wasn't particularly a part of mainstream culture? Yet, the very existence of it was enough for our instigating incident to bring the role-playing game into the national spotlight. I'm going to stick a content warning at this point and say that when we go to the voiceover for this one, it's going to include references to self-harm and suicide. So if that's something you want to swerve, I completely understand. Here is the timestamp that you can skip to just skip the entire section there. Meanwhile, let's go to the voiceover and see what happened.
In 1979, 16-year-old child prodigy James Dallas Egbert III disappeared from his room at Michigan State University. Private investigator William Deere was hired by James's parents to find their son. Despite apparently knowing little about role-playing games, Deere believed that D&D was the cause of Egbert's disappearance. In truth, Egbert suffered from, among other things, depression and drug addiction, and had gone into hiding in the utility tunnels under the university during an episode of self-harm. The well-publicised episode, referred to as the Steam Tunnel Incident, prompted a number of works of fiction, including the novel Mazes and Monsters and the 1982 Tom Hanks film of the same name. Egbert later died from self-inflicted gunshot wound in 1980. Despite the evidence regarding his mental health problems, some activists believed Egbert's suicide was caused by D&D.
We can see the first step here pretty aptly summarised. We have an instigating incident, the disappearance of this 16-year-old, and behaviour that's considered outside of the mainstream to pin this incident onto. In this case, it was playing D&D. In this case, though, the disappearance and the subsequent events were likely the result of other factors mentioned in that passage, not pretending to be a character in a role-playing game. So stage 2 of the process is that the press report on it in an exaggerated way. And yes, it has to be the press, usually at the national level, because, look, let's be real, if you were sat at the pub and some boomer walked up to you and started ranting about how a child was a Satanist because they were rolling a d20, your reaction is most likely going to be, oh, that's lovely, yes, oh, we must talk about that later, rather than immediately feeling threatened and demanding some kind of action. So you'll see hysterical press coverage, both in the written press and the broadcast press. I mean, just look at this from a particularly British moral panic, the ninja moral panic. Yeah, so that's a thing that happened. God, this country, man. I cannot cope with some of the stuff that's gone on here. And if you want an idea of how insane this got, in the UK, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are called Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, or were called that for a while. And yeah, it's exactly as ridiculous as it sounds. I'll put the logo up somewhere for you so you know I'm not bullshitting, but yeah, things can get out of hand very quickly. Now, I'm not just going to pick on the UK here. I want to share a particular moral panic that I love and that I keep referring to as the Mass Effect alien lesbian sex moral panic, where Fox News didn't understand how video games work. I'll link to the full segment down in the description, but holy shit, this stuff is insane. Let's go to a couple of clips.
Sort of cracks me up whenever I hear a company say that, there's all these controls in there that you can monitor the time and you can, but basically Pandora's box is open. I mean, kids have access to these things, and unless you're hovering over them every second, they're going to find ways to see this stuff on the internet. How damaging is it really?
Well, the thing is, it's the whole concept of 13-year-olds have never seen Playboy because they're not supposed to. It's that idea that, let's talk about who the video game is for. It might be for adults, but if you look at the statistics, who is playing video games but adolescent males, not their dads? So that's the first thing. The damage is this. We know that all the research shows that violence has a desensitizing effect. Well, sexuality does too, because this is when the developing mind is happening. This is when they're first deciding who they're going to be, who their identity is. This is when social development is happening. And here's how they're seeing women. They're seeing them as these objects of desire, as these, hot bodies. I mean, they don't show women as being valued for anything other than their sexuality. And it's a man in this game deciding how many women he wants to be with.
All right, let's get Jeff in on this.
All right, that's
go ahead,
completely
Jeff.
Incorrect. Yeah, it's completely incorrect. First of all, you can actually play as a man or a woman in the game. Cooper, have you ever played Mass Effect?
No.
Right. Well, I think the fact is you talked about, another thing that you mentioned is that how it's, has full graphic nudity. That's completely incorrect. There's no full nudity in this game. There's the side of an alien boob which can be seen. It's a small sexual situation in this game, which is about 2 minutes out of a 30-plus hour experience.
But it does beg the question, what it does to kids in terms of how they think about violence and sexuality, because they're, engaged and blowing people away in these.
Well, I think what's interesting about this, we talk about, sexuality in the media. One of the great things about Mass Effect, for people that have played it know this is a sort of a choose-your-own-adventure story, and it doesn't force you down any situation. You can actually play through this game without the sexual situation ever happening.
Right, and the young boys
game.
are going to be choosing not to have sex. That'll be what they'll choose.
No,
let's be
because
realistic
it's not a simple choice. But Cooper, it's not a simple choice. You don't turn to the game and says, would you like to have sex or not?
I actually really liked Mass Effects 1 and 2, and most of 3. Look, I'm not going to get into the whole ending thing on this video. And I played the first 2 games over and over and over. Never figured out how to have full control over the sex in the game, though. Really didn't get my money's worth if that was a feature they snuck in and I couldn't quite figure out how to do. So you can see how a lie, and to be clear, that was a lie. I'm reasonably sure that wasn't a feature in the game. If there's any BioWare devs watching this, please tell me if you did sneak it in. So you can see how a lie, and to be clear, that is what this was, can be used in an attempt to create a backlash from the public. The example I used here was more or less harmless, especially given that Fox News essentially failed to create any kind of meaningful moral panic around the game, but that's not always the case. And it's easy to see how these kinds of dynamics may be playing out now in much, much more harmful ways. So stage 3 is disproportionate public fear. So if the press doesn't bungle it, like Fox News did in their Mass Effect moral panic, the public reacts in some way. That manifests itself in a unique way for each moral panic. The typical way the public reacts is like this.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
And it's often children that are the ones who need to be protected from whatever the folk devil is at the time. And we'll see in stage 4, it's very interesting how the reaction tends to be something related directly to the media consumption of children, and how often the instigating incidents tend to involve children. If public fear properly takes hold, you can begin to see pressure put on electoral politicians. If everyone in the country believes video games are making their kids Satanists or whatever, suddenly some kind of regulations of video games may become very important to people, and of course the escalation of the moral panic into disproportionate public fear means that the press can keep on churning articles and news segments about the topic and get lots of eyes on their work. Stage 4, which is the final stage that we'll talk about, but moral panics can continue past this stage, is some kind of disproportionate state reaction, sometimes. So in the case of the extremely cool video game Mortal Kombat, a moral panic around the game's fatalities, which in the original look incredibly soft compared to the stuff in the latest game. We can just compare the two right now real quickly.
Sub-Zero wins. Flawless victory. Fatality.
Fatality. Scorpion wins.
Because of this, we now have age ratings for video games because of the first one. Because a spine sprite being pulled out of a ninja was way too much for people to take. There were congressional hearings, and in case you think the Mortal Kombat hearings were the most clownish thing that could have happened, wait until you hear about the spectacle of Dee Snider of Twisted Sister showing up to the US Congress, which will always stand as a great summary of why moral panics serve to make everyone lose. We'll look at more specific moral panics in the next section, particularly some more serious ones, but sometimes the consequences of a moral panic isn't just an age rating for a video game, or a spectacle where a glam rock band member owns Al Gore's wife like this.
It's not really a wild leap of the imagination to jump to the conclusion that that's about something other than surgery or hospitals, neither of which are mentioned in the song.
No, it's not a wild jump, and I think what I said in one part was that songs allow a person to put their own imagination, experiences, and dreams into the lyrics. People can interpret it many ways. Ms. Gore was looking for sadomasochism and bondage, and she found it. Someone looking for surgical references would have found it as well.
Sometimes it has serious consequences and can result in the restriction of social and political rights. This might sound similar to the whole idea of the culture war, especially given that a lot of the same actors such as the press and politicians play a role in it. The only thing I would say as a point of caution when trying to connect the two is that moral panickers and culture warriors tend to be at different levels of engagement with politics generally, and the issues tend to have different salience at different times. Moral panics only really tend to work because there's actual public outcry about an issue, whereas culture warriors tend to take issues that no one really gives a fuck about outside of really engaged activists and turn them into issues of public concern, admittedly with varying degrees of success. This isn't helped by the fact that some culture war issues, things like immigration, the rights of LGBTQ+ people, and whether university professors are secretly Marxists, can overlap with moral panics, some of which have been ongoing for a very, very long time and have roots that stretch back decades. So I guess that means we should actually take a look at some moral panics and see how they fit into our anatomy here, which is what we'll be doing in the next section.
Examining moral panics.
There have been a lot of moral panics, and they've ranged from trivial things that haven't necessarily specifically impacted groups in a way that would have put them in danger or anything like that, to the batshit crazy frothing at the mouth panics that have actually directly led to people getting hurt. So what I'm going to try to do here is separate out the examples of moral panics and divide them into 3-ish categories. Yeah, there will be some overlaps between them because these categories aren't exhausted and they're centered on the Anglosphere, which is mainly because I speak English. I suppose that makes a lot of sense. The categories are cultural, identity, and political. First, let's talk about moral panics that center around culture. I mentioned it earlier and shared a clip with you all, but the panic around Mass Effect and whether or not you could control the character in the romance cutscenes is a pretty good example. I just realized I may be opening up a tin of worms about our video games culture. Yes, they are, so this completely counts. In fact, if at the beginning of this video, if you had said that video games were the moral panic that had been going on for at least 35 years, you would have been correct. There are actually multiple correct answers, and I'm sure you've all told me them in the comments, but that was the one I was thinking of. In fact, the first video game that I could see that generated the moral panic was probably the 1976 game Death Race, which looked like this. Now, don't get me wrong, video game moral panics are still stupid as fuck, but at least Mortal Kombat had something going on for people to get angry at. I get that the objective of the game was to run over pedestrians, but do you really think that this is enough stimulation to drive someone to do that? We do have an example of a video game moral panic that had a violent instigating incident. Warning once again, I'm going to be making some references to violent events. The Columbine High School massacre was understandably the subject of a lot of media attention, and inevitably the media attention turned to the cause. Now, there are many things that could drive a person to do this sort of thing, and the perpetrators of the massacre did mention 2 video games in their discussions, Duke Nukem 3D and Doom. Now, it should come as no surprise that I think video games probably didn't have anything to do with the shooting. In fact, the panic about video games had hit such a fever pitch that the parents of some of the victims tried to sue the video game developers. So here are some excerpts from an article about it.
The lawsuit was filed by the family of slain teacher David Sanders and on behalf of other Columbine victims. It alleged that the makers and distributors of the games and movies should have known that their products could have led student gunmen Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold to carry out the massacre.
So the judge understandably dismissed this, including on these grounds, which I just find spectacular that this was something they actually tried to push. Let's go to another reading.
Babcock also rejected the argument that the video games were defective because they taught Harris and Klebold how to point and shoot guns without teaching them the responsibility or consequences of using weapons.
This is kind of a weird argument to bring to the table against these games in particular, since, get this, it's not actually real. There's never been any evidence that video games or heavy metal, which people also tried to blame for the Columbine massacre, or any of the other things that the press and the parents like to blame for things that they've whipped themselves up into a frenzy about, leads to these behaviors. Then there are moral panics that revolve around some kind of identity. There are 2 that spring to mind immediately. Being trapped, as I am, in the UK. The various Islamophobic and transphobic moral panics that we have. Those 2 are by no means the only ones. I've mentioned the general anti-immigrant moral panics around whether Romanian men are all living in a house together, which I have to be honest, I struggle to get animated about, since the default condition in this country is being forced to live with a bunch of people, since housing is so fucking abysmal and in the hands of parasites, also known as landlords. I got sidetracked. Let's get back to the moral panics. I won't be getting into the transphobic moral panic in too much detail, since there are plenty of videos out there that cover the topic talking about specific public figures who have fallen for the moral panic and have entered the rabbit hole never to return. Just suffice to say that, like pretty much all of these moral panics, it's a load of bullshit and we should be aware that it is and challenge it where we can. I'll have some more thoughts on the specifics of challenging them in the conclusion. The identity-focused moral panic I want to focus on is one that's managed to make its way back into the news, well, sort of. It's not a secret, but the UK has, let's call it, a challenge with Islamophobia and how it informs government policy towards the Muslim community in the UK. Recently, a podcast made waves. Yeah, I know, we're talking about podcasts, but trust me, it's worth it. The Trojan Horse affair. If I were to say these words to you and you weren't from the UK, you would probably be very confused by what I meant, or whether I just misremembered what the Trojan War was called. The Trojan Horse affair was an alleged secret plot to secretly take over schools in Birmingham and introduce Islamist or Salafist principles into education. Why did this plot come to national attention? Because of a letter, which was fake, by the way, which outlined a clandestine plan to take over a series of schools in Birmingham and implement this agenda. The press, as you might imagine, went wild with it, and even though the letter was well known to be a fake, there was a sense that something had to be done because of a general sense of panic that had been whipped up by the press and by members of the government who decided that Islamophobia was a vote winner. This particular incident shows us the usual stages of a moral panic, in this case leading to the prevent strategy becoming statutory, which is a counter-terrorism strategy that aims to stop people becoming terrorists in the first place. Usually what it's meant in reality is racist targeting of people, especially children, who usually aren't doing anything. It also shows us an interesting additional phase, which is that the core premise of the moral panic was debunked. The letter was a forgery, and the letter's origin seems fairly relevant to understanding why all of this happened in the first place. Anyway, I won't get into that too much. Check out the podcast, which I'll link below if you want to hear the specifics, but the reaction to the podcast was interesting. In fact, I'll put one of the reactions to the podcast in the form of a headline up here or over me, but the press rallied around and circled the wagons, insisting that the podcast had got it wrong. Now, don't get me wrong. A podcast is hardly beyond criticism, but one thing the podcast identified was a lack of basic competence on the part of the British press. Or if you want me to be more cynical, they deliberately neglected to do their jobs, in favour of stoking a moral panic that they knew would suit their ideological agendas and get them lots of views or clicks or papers sold. Are papers still sold? I genuinely don't know. I'll get to what we can try to do to counter moral panics in the conclusion, but this reaction from the press to one of the easiest ways to combat them, by debunking the moral panic, may not fill you with great confidence that you can break these cycles. One of the main takeaways from this kind of moral panic is people's lives get ruined by these kinds of fabrications and exaggerations. When the press get a hold of them and start the moral panic machine, often you can't stop it and people's lives are completely destroyed. We have the final kind of moral panic, the one which is centered around political identities and ideologies. The most famous one of these is the Second Red Scare, or the regime of McCarthyism that the US implemented. Now here's the thing. Would the Soviet Union have spies in the US? Sure. I'm reasonably sure the US had spies in the Soviet Union. Was the US overrun with communists to the extent of McCarthy's list, which generated the press attention for the Second Red Scare? No, not really. Most of the legal reprisals caused by the moral panic were overturned, which kind of suggests to me that the US did not in fact have a massive number of subversive communist elements, which is a shame. It would have been much cooler if it did. The anti-communist moral panic led to blacklisting, arrests, lives ruined, as in the last type of moral panic. Not exactly light consequences, and anti-communism has been a force for destruction around the world. If you want to see where this kind of thinking leads if left unchecked, I highly recommend reading the Jakarta Method. It's not light reading, but it is fantastic. This domestic atmosphere of anti-communism encouraged by the moral panic had consequences around the world, like the things described in the Jakarta Method. This also leads me to think about our very own recent experiment with anti-communism in the UK. Only there wasn't really any communism to be anti-communist towards. So you'd see press derangement as they jump from one reason to another between 2015 and, well, today, to find a reason to scream at left-wingers who have any kind of public profile. While the press turning a movement that wanted slightly higher taxes and green energy into a series of folk devils could, and might, be the subject of its very own video, all I'll say on the matter is moral panics have consequences, and the attitudes that were displayed from 2015 onwards had a lot of the characteristics of a moral panic. So, with these examples and our understanding of how moral panics function, I want to look at whether anyone actually benefits from moral panics. So let's go take a look at that.
Does anyone benefit?
We've gone through a lot of different examples of moral panics, and I have a question. It's the title of the section. Who's benefiting from all of this? One of the easiest ways for us to start drawing conclusions about who's benefiting is looking at who's getting screwed over and how. Moral panics often have a negative impact on their targets, but negative impact is vague. And I'm being vague on purpose because there's a difference between the seriousness of different moral panics and their consequences. For example, people who enjoy video games having to deal with age ratings because Mortal Kombat was slightly too graphic for the sensibilities of dipshit in the 90s is, well, less than ideal, I suppose, because it brings in a level of censorship. That being said, it's not exactly the same as a moral panic designed to exploit fears and prejudice embedded within society to then see your community policed more harshly, as in the case of the Trojan Horse affair. Or in the case of trans people, we've recently seen Texas implement a measure that would take trans children away from their parents and force them into conversion therapy, which is torture. I'm not even exaggerating, go look it up. So, when the consequences for being outside of the mainstream range from inconvenience to outright violence, I have to be the bad guy here and say that while the censorship and the inconvenience are certainly bad, they're not who we're going to be looking at most closely when we talk about the targets of moral panics who suffer the most. Though there will almost certainly be some overlap between some of these things, just because people are multifaceted in that way. When we look at the targets of moral panics, I want us to look at who these people are and what their relationships are with the mainstream of society. Let's take the anti-youth moral panics of the New Labour years. I spoke about this in my video on Lesser Evil, but the one thing I didn't touch on was how youth culture was often a stand-in for black people in the UK, which adds a whole new dimension to the state measures brought in by New Labour, which included these insane machines that were designed to irritate young people who were loitering outside of shops. And not to go on too much of a tangent, if you don't want young people hanging out on the street outside of shops, give them shit to do. Just have shit available for them to do. It's amazing how fucking stupid this country is. Oh my fucking god. Right off the bat, we have minority groups being targeted by moral panics. This illustrates something particularly in the context of societies like the UK, where a lot of the young people who were subjected to these measures went on to become, if not socialists, because, you know, words mean things, they became anti-conservative to varying degrees, whether it was simply partisan opposition or something more substantial. Moral panics are the ultimate small c conservative tool to reassert their dominance, often through a press that's incentivized to act in that way. If you're a small c conservative, you're not likely to be fully comfortable with the kind of things that, say, I would be comfortable with. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but when that attitude gets pandered to for the financial benefit of clickbaity newspaper websites, for example, in the case of the anti-immigrant moral panics we have in the UK about people getting free housing, when that doesn't exist, that's kind of a fucking problem. That plays to a small c conservative anti-immigrant sentiment. Some would say it's playing directly to racism, and I would say that. But that's not where the audience is for a lot of the press. It's about being more subtle than that, and moral panics, while they're often very blunt tools and often involve incoherent screeching, they still very rarely come out and say what it is they're actually mad at. Take the McCarthyite Second Red Scare. Was McCarthy mad at communism? Yeah, probably. I'd buy that he'd be pissed off at communism. Was communism a real issue in America? No. No, it was not. If you look at who was targeted by the Second Red Scare and who was on the, famous list of his, you'd find an awful lot of people from minority backgrounds. kind of a hint that the problem was something else, and a secret communist plot was kind of a convenient screen for a lot of other things. We can see from various examples, and our little bit of thinking about who the victims of moral panics usually are, that they're a tool to entrench or expand conservative positions in its society. We can see from the various examples and our little bit of thinking about who the victims of moral panics usually are, that they're a tool to expand conservative positions in society or entrench them. And they pretty much always need the force multiplier of the press to create enough social reaction to impact things like government policy. That's what makes them so insidious. Often it's total mercenaries, or sometimes culture warriors, who are stoking these perceptions of people who sit outside the mainstream. The worst part, there's not really an effective way to counter them once they get rolling. At least not in a symmetrical way. Take the recent example of Damp Ham and the least photogenic man in the world, Keir Starmer. He was recently smeared by the Prime Minister of the UK, and I won't repeat the smear, but even with a press that's at least somewhat sympathetic to Keir Starmer, there were an awful lot of people just repeating the smear over and over again in newspapers, on the radio, on TV, and that's before we even get into the hell that's social media. So, if the Knight of the Realm can get smeared in this way, what chance do minority groups have, who don't have access to these platforms or supportive figures who will go out to defend them? I'll offer some thoughts on whether moral panics can ever be beaten, and some other things in the next section, which is where I'll be wrapping up.
Concluding thoughts.
As I try to come to some kind of conclusion here, I want to think about whether there's a way to come out on top if you're being made into a folk devil by a moral panic. As I said in the last section, there's not really a symmetrical way to deal with it. I stand by that by and large. If you're the target of a moral panic, part of the reason will be because you can't really fight back. Well, not in the way that these people fight you or that registers to them. So what can you do? Well, one thing you could do is get rid of the press incentive to engage in moral panics, and that would mean getting rid of the content economy and the profit motive. Which I have to say, as a content person with the Patreon, is a bold pitch for me to be making, but I guess in a sense, what I want to do is create a moral panic about moral panics. But that would probably be a sign that we'd be moving on from a lot of the things making life miserable at the moment, so I'm not holding my breath. Another way you could tackle it is just by existing as the person you are. You're probably cool, especially if you're still watching the video at this point. Only the coolest make it to this point. In all seriousness though, the reason why video game moral panics are now laughed out of the room is because video games have, for better or worse, become a part of the mainstream culture. And most people are fucking stupid about stuff they've never encountered. Or worse, have only read about in the Daily fucking Mail or whatever. But I understand why that would be hard in a lot of cases, and I wish it wasn't. In any case, we can be aware of how these dynamics work, point to them, and try our best to counter them in whatever way we can. I want to thank my proofreaders and the people who provided voiceovers. So proofreaders were my partner and Mick Wright, as usual. Thank you so much to them. And the 3 people who provided my fantastic voiceovers, that's Mick Wright again. He's getting a lot of work from me these days. Friend of mine, John Duncan, who has a fantastic YouTube channel. You should all go check it out. John the Duncan on here. And Dr. Eleanor Yanaga, who is an excellent historian, and joins me once a month for a stream where we play Crusader Kings 3 together, and it's always a fantastic time, so you should come join us on stream sometime. And also, I want to thank my patrons who will appear here now. There you go. And I particularly want to thank Drone Riff, Mercutio, Nauseum, and Kerstley Scheider. Thank you so much for your support. If you want your name on the wall and to get a thank you from me, just check out the Patreon. There are 3 tiers. There are lots of different benefits for you. Just check it out, and if you can afford it, come join us. Otherwise, everyone, I'm gonna get out of your way. I hope we all learned something today and enjoyed the video. Have a nice day, and I'll see you next time.